Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. Welcome, Matt, and I'm going to say welcome to the listeners as well, because this is an inaugural fireside chat, which we haven't had on the podcast before, but it's going to be a fireside chat exploring big ideas for UK foreign policy. And one of the aims for this podcast, as listeners will know, is to, throughout conversations, to build a picture of how the UK can act in the world of the 2020s and 2030s. And that's really about how the UK relates to the world as it is today, as opposed to how it was previously. Yeah. And because it's such a changing reality, one of the aims of this podcast, and I know many people engaging in foreign policy right now in the UK, is to seek out a pragmatic and visionary picture of how Britain can be clear about its modern identity, proud of itself, and confident about its value adds. And so in this vein of thought leadership, Matt, you and I have started to unpack things together, haven't we? And really try to grapple with some of the underdeveloped thoughts, perhaps, or look at what's missing. Where is the space? Where do we need to advance our thinking about who the UK is in the world? And so you and I have started to build out ideas, haven't we, of key concepts that we think, where we think a new framework or paradigm is needed. But before we do that, can you introduce yourself, Matt?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, Anna-Joy, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a delight to speak to and with your listeners. And I think it's an ongoing dialogue, undoubtedly, between us. But I'm really hoping it will be with your listeners as well. Because I think that they're very, very keen, and I'm sure as are better placed than I am to contribute to this conversation. So it's really, really nice to be here. I think I've been a scholar, of foreign policy for a long time, from a university, I suppose, standpoint, but also in a public affairs standpoint, working in Parliament in both the UK and Canada, and working in public affairs in the UK for the last number of years. I'll touch specifically on a book that I launched last year called Disaggregating Diasporas as a Force and Role Contestation, Mobilizing the Marginalized in Foreign Affairs. I appreciate that's a huge mouthful. It's an academic book that emerged out of my PhD dissertation. And really, the whole premise for the book and the origin of it is I was in Toronto in 2009, and it was during the close of the Sri Lankan Civil War, which, if you remember, was a very, very dramatic, extremely brutal, extremely difficult time, not only for people in Sri Lanka, but for diaspora members of, in particular, the Tamil community from Sri Lanka in many countries, both in Canada and the UK. And I remember seeing these huge protests in Toronto, these human chains of hundreds of thousands of people that were so impassioned, and thinking about what was mobilizing this, what kind of impact were they having. It was the largest demonstration I'd ever seen. And that spurred this research conversation question that I've had for a long time is, do non-governmental organizations, civil society groups in particular, have influence over foreign affairs in pluralist democracies like Canada and the UK? Being multicultural, being diverse, being pluralist is, some people would say not multicultural, but certainly diverse. I think we can all agree on that, is foundational to these two countries. And do these diaspora communities influence foreign affairs in these types of countries? And that was the essence of the book. I looked a lot at the role of Canada, its foreign policy history, the same with the UK, comparing the two, the capabilities, understanding, one as a middle power, the other is perhaps slightly more influential than that. And that was the impetus and generation of the book. And it's really interesting to see the conversations that we're having in the UK reflect, I think, a lot of that research that I've been doing before. So that's the essence of the book, yeah.
Yeah, love it. And you're, of course, a Canadian who's made your home in the UK. Tell us about other sort of personal reference points that you bring as you look at geopolitics or as you talk about the UK in the world.
I remember, I think that's a really good, and it sounds like a bit of a cheeky and comment or anecdote, but I remember growing up and thinking, wow, Britain must be a really great country. They call themselves great. No other country calls themselves great something. These people must be amazing if they're calling themselves great. Sort of with the youth, the naivety of youth. But it was always a country that attracted me, that attracts a lot of people around the world, attracts the attention. It was always a place that you felt you wanted to be if you wanted to be in the action, in the heart of it, in the hub of global conversations and discourse. And that was one of the main draws for me in wanting to be here and wanting to be a part of the political and policy dialogue in this country. And, you know, that I think that speaks to soft power, but it also speaks to the influence and contribution that the country has. And I can see it even now. I was having a conversation at a conference with a friend of mine who's quite active in Canadian public affairs, and there's a very pressing international issue. A big decision was made on it in Canada. And he said, you know, at the end of the day, I'm not entirely sure this is going to have that much influence on the outcome of the issue at hand. And I think we rarely bring that lens in this country because there is generally often an impact that this country can have, even if not as much as some of the sort of, you know, the Russia, Chinas, and the USs of the world. There's always something to be said about what the UK is thinking on these issues. And I think that's one of the things that brought me to the country, but also in particular to these issues. So yeah, Great Britain, origin story, I suppose, of Matt Godwin. Anna-Joy, what about you? What brought you to this area of work?
Yeah, I love these questions because they dig around a bit, don't they, to find out, like, why do you come at something with a instinctive initial thought? And I think for me, I'd summarize it as probably three quite significant reference points. I think one of my reference points is in my recent career, actually sitting with West African leaders and hearing their perspectives. Mm. Sometimes I say I learnt my geopolitics on a small island nation and in the desert under the stars. And essentially, there's something very powerful about learning from very wise leaders, but who are in a completely different location in the world. Mm. And I learned a lot in those conversations from a point of view of absorbing wisdom, but I also learned when you're not in the position that you've just described, and we're going to unpack this a bit more, aren't we, about Britain, because there's the great, and then there's who are we, and all these questions. But as you said, it's a given often in UK foreign policy conversations that you have some level of leverage or influence, or that you can find it somehow. Mm. And I was sitting with leaders that have influence in their region, but have to be a lot more clever and creative in the way that they interact with the rest of the world. And sometimes they see things playing out that they don't have that much leverage over, but they're very much impacted by. On the other hand, I mean, incredible. I think that's why I start with the idea of wisdom, because the way that countries that I was interacting with navigate that is fascinating, and we have a lot to learn from. So I think the West Africa leaders' perspective has really impacted me. It builds on the fact that I spent a couple of years in Latin America at the beginning of my career doing community development. And again, that's a region of the world that we don't follow very much in the UK. And so I always feel like instinctively I sit with these perspectives that in the UK they're classed as rest of the world, right? Sometimes you can go in to some of the more traditional UK foreign policy discussions, and we're actually talking about UK, talking about Europe, and then you go China, Russia, and whole parts of the world are just completely forgotten. So I think that's one reference point, an important one to me, and loving the countries that I lived in and was part of the national discussions of. I think that I instinctively think, well, what? How can we have a global conversation if we're just missed out these enormous continents, enormous regions? So that's part of it. Another reference point for me comes from growing up in the English countryside. And I grew up in a little village in East Anglia. It was the village that makes Hartley's strawberry jam, what is now. So strawberries, basically strawberry farms. Everyone picked them in the summer. You know, every fete and festival had strawberries and cream. They were everywhere in the summer. The village had grown around the jam factory. And so it's very much an experience of English country rural traditions. And you don't realise that when you grow up. You don't necessarily understand where you are. It's just a normal life, isn't it? But there very much was the experience of maypole dancing, floats. We would have like a feast week each July, and everyone would get together in the big field on the edge of the village, and the big back of lorries that take these straw bales through the countryside, they would roll in, and each village group would build their display, and you'd sit on them, and they'd roll through the village. The entire village would be out throwing money, throwing sweets.
Did you have like a king and queen of the festival every year or something like that? This is how I imagine it in my head.
There was no king and queen, but I did know there are similar traditions replicated up and down the country where there are. And the reason these things matter to me is that they're part of our identity and they're part of who we are, right? And I've always been really interested in how we find a foreign policy that we have to be confident of our identity abroad, and that's a confidence about who we are in our national identity. And there are many different environments where our country does know who it is and what it's doing in many different cities, villages, towns. And there's something about bridging that gap between those traditions and that history and that understanding of who we are and then who we are in the world today. And I think the bit for me that was always the bridge was I grew up in that environment, but my dad was a civil engineer, and they'd lived in the Middle East and Southern Africa before I was born. So there was that influence, but then my parents sitting around the dinner table would talk about Middle East in a way that they very much knew about people they knew. We would have visitors from Southern Africa. Our house had different cuisine and different people sort of coming through it, and there was a sense of being in a small village but a large world.
Yeah.
I think the final thing, which just links to what you said, I live now in East London. I was a local elected councillor for 8 years here in Hackney, and I mean Hackney is the example, the epitome of multiculturalism, right? And diversity and different communities living alongside each other. I think that we have over 100 languages spoken in Hackney, and that's an experience of corner shop multiculturalism, I think they call it. And there's something very powerful and quite amazing about that. And I've come to realise how amazing it is that we have parts of our country like Hackney and many other places that are very diverse. Because when I go abroad and you talk about London, I mean, people in Spain said, we don't have anywhere like this. The idea that it's an example that different people in different communities, diaspora communities, and you started to mention this, can live alongside each other and feel as one. The London 2012 Olympics was part of this, right? Like an incredible celebration of modern Britain. I think that could be described of, or certainly London. And so there's something about that I feel like some of our experience of many communities living together help us transition. It's not to take away from our traditional heritage and some of the descriptions I was describing, but the traditions. But there's something that helps us if we could somehow marry up those traditions, the deep English traditions and Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish, with multiculturalism today, and help it interface with the world and its changing reality. I feel like we might be able to get somewhere quite interesting.
I think that's right. And I mean, I'm glad you brought up the 2012 Olympics, because I think, if you think back to that time, there was the Olympics, there was the Jubilee of the Queen. I mean, one of my colleagues said, and I've often thought this myself, that was almost like the high water mark for Britain in the post-war world, both in terms of its self-confidence, its kind of image in standing abroad. It was at a time when the UK had been a very, very active state in reference to everything from the financial crisis to the G8 and Make Poverty History and ending extreme poverty and climate change, one of the first countries to really get and act on the climate change issue. I mean, we can go on and on and on, but it seemed to me like 2012 was that moment where where Britain felt extremely confident about itself and its identity abroad. And I guess, we're certainly not in that place now, are we? I mean, I think 2012 is a very good sort of place to compare ourselves to, temporally at least, now. And I certainly felt that living abroad. I moved to the UK a year later to start my PhD in London, and I could feel the almost hangover is not the right word, it's the opposite of that. The enthusiasm and the energy that was still there from the year before, because it was still absolutely the place that you wanted to be in the world at that time. And I do think that London is, the interesting thing is that we always say London is unique. London needs no introduction anywhere. Like there's no city apart from maybe New York that is like it, as we say. But it's interesting you talk about the countryside. I'm also not sure there are many places in the world where you can go to deep, deep countryside. The conference I was just at was International Middle East Conference on the Christ. It was deep in the countryside. I mean, you wouldn't find this place on a map or unless you really know where it is. And I can't think of another part of the world where that is the case, where we're able to just not only convene some of the top thinkers in the world, not just in our capital city, but outside of the city. And I think people come to this place for that. They think they can, and I believe they can find a place for constructive dialogue on difficult issues in a way that they almost can't do anywhere else. And the UK does that extremely well. It still does that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just want to reference, of course, the northern cities that are part of the powerhouse as well of the country. And I think my grandparents are from Yorkshire, my dad's from Yorkshire, my granddad was a tailor in a factory in Leeds, and we always went up and down to see them. And that sense that there's a great heritage as well, and a great level of pride and leadership actually from the north of our country is also has to be part of these conversations. It's really fundamental. And interestingly, the Olympics were London showing itself to the world, but of course the entire country was part of it, wasn't it?
And you could see the visual of that I remember the introductory montage video. Everybody remembers James Bond and the Queen and everything like that. But I remember the whole country was being touched on. So I agree with you. It wasn't just that London was spotlighted. The Olympics did a fantastic job of spotlighting the country in a way that I'm not sure many other Olympics or sort of international occasions do. So that was felt. I absolutely, as someone who was living outside, I did feel that. I did feel the presence of Scotland and Wales and other areas of and Northern Ireland and other areas of the country. Yeah, I thought that was right.
So this is therefore a good segue into our conversation, isn't it? Because that's 12 years ago. We're in 2024.
Yeah.
You and me have really started to grapple and have a conversation about where we are right now as Britain and what we have to really grapple with and get a handle on if we're going to orientate ourselves as a country that is responding to the world of 2024 and beyond. Do you want to start by framing that kind of moment that we're talking about?
I think there's two things, because speaking together in the UK and UK foreign policy in particular, it's very difficult to not think about the year ahead, the potential political changes in this country, the potential for, a new political era emerging in the country. No one's, has a crystal ball, but that we would be ignoring the elephant in the room if we didn't speak to that reality. And I think as we saw, when New Labour came in 97 and when the coalition government led by the Conservative Party came in 2010, those were opportunities for the country and the new government to consider the UK's place in the world, especially vis-a-vis the world as they found it, because we're in a completely different situation from 97. I mean, you think about it, it was only a few years after the end of the Cold War, the so-called end of history, a moment of significant Western confidence, I suppose, in many ways, of which the UK was a part, and sort of the emergence of the kind of human security priorities that were coming out of the sort of the Robin Cook thinking around ethical foreign policy. Axworthy in Canada, foreign minister in Canada, was thinking along the same lines in terms of what can the international community do to intervene to make life better. It was almost like this world-making time of optimism in some strange way, with, I think, many constructive results. And then in 2010, there was a similar rethink in many ways towards the kind of liberal conservatism that David Cameron was thinking of at the time, about being multilateralist, but also thinking about the interests of the country. And that's when a lot of the thinking around trade, through diplomacy and trade, aid for trade, that type of thing was emerging. And now I think there could be a significant opportunity again to rethink the way the country approaches the international sort of dynamic. But it is a very different world right now, isn't it, than in either of these two other big transitions?
Yeah. On this podcast, there was the episode that I did with Pete Apps on NATO, and he was talking in a similar way about NATO after the Second World War, and Bevan being a strong figure from the UK side on that. And again, that moment. And so you find there just always are these moments, aren't they, within a significant, what looks like will be a significant election year, quite typical in the UK. We would expect that now, wouldn't we? And polling looks like that's what will happen. But equally, a certain period after Brexit, that's also... Exactly. So from the internal dynamics of the UK, this does feel like a new moment. But from the external dynamics, so much has changed, and it's changing so quickly, isn't it? Yeah. And we've been looking at that in different ways in this podcast. We've got the acceleration of the US versus China, multipolar world conflict, and a shift into transactional geopolitics, as it's being called, where you described it as a country will go, what's your breakfast, lunch, dinner?
I mean, I was saying that there's this idea of I'm trying to pivot region or pivot country, which is to say these are places and countries. Historically, we called the non-aligned movement, didn't we? We were talking about what we would now call mostly global South countries that didn't want to align with the Soviet Union or with the West. We're in a similar position where there are the majority of countries don't want to commit themselves lock, stock, and barrel with either the Western alliance with Russia or with China. What they want is a degree of autonomy. They want a degree of agency, and they're happy to have breakfast with the US, lunch with China, and dinner with Russia, depending on what happens to be on offer on a case-by-case basis. They can have a security arrangement with one partner, but then might speak about agriculture or might speak about some other type of arrangement with another great power. And I think what makes the time different from 30 or 40 years ago is that many of these countries, they have the capacity as well as the ambition for agency. And, you look at Saudi Arabia and the UAE in terms of their engagement in Africa and in other places, that's not something that we were thinking about in the same way 30 or 40 years ago. And it's not just them, obviously. Brazil, India, and China was a country that we put into that category 40 years ago. It is now nowhere near that, despite the fact that it frames itself still as a developing country. I think quite effectively from a soft power standpoint. We're in a very, very different world. And one thing I will say, just as we were talking about this, in the context of the election, people are sitting back and thinking about countries are saying, but think about their decisions based on the U.S. election in November. Yeah. They're saying, we're going to decide this now, or we're not going to. We're going to wait for November, because no one is thinking that way about the UK election. You know what I'm saying? No country is going to anchor their decision-making necessarily based on the UK election. From a bilateral standpoint, they might be, but from a multilateral standpoint, they probably aren't. And I think that speaks to the fact that the UK is very influential, but it does need to fight its way into the table. The world is not going to wait for the UK to think of how it wants to be and think about its foreign policy, if you see what I'm saying. I think that's probably fair. What do you think? Is that too strong? Is that harsh? Or
no, I think that's absolutely fair. Basically our summary is this is an opportunity for a new era, a new moment. It's both internally and externally, isn't it? But the same old approach, or an approach that we used 10 years ago or 15 years ago or in our historically, isn't going to work. That's the thing that's particularly pertinent to me, that it feels to me like we're now at a crossroads where either we form a new sense of who we are in the world. We have a new paradigm, we have a new framework for the way that we interact in the world, or we get a bit lost, to be honest. Yep. The old ways of doing things aren't going to work because this world is so different, as you're describing. I definitely have the sense that both the British public and the British political class, and probably our media as well, we haven't quite caught up, I think, with how much the world is changing. This is tricky, isn't it? Because domestic policy will always be the thing that's on most people's minds. It's the reality of your life on an everyday, weekly basis. And even in an election year, the domestic policy is the front and centre, isn't it? Foreign policy matters on day one of government. It matters a lot on day one of government. But before that, it's not what people will go to the polls for, except for in kind of exceptional circumstances. And so we are at a crossroads. We're at a place where we either find a bold, new, confident and realistic vision, or we kind of not meander on, but we just move up consistently forward with the same paradigm as before, and in the end up with a less of a sort of diminished sense of both who we are, what we're bringing to the table, but also we miss out on opportunities. We're not leveraging sufficiently. We're not achieving what we could in the world and for British citizens. And should we jump into the Britain's place in the world and how we can capture that idea of where we are in the pecking order?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think just to touch on that, on that earlier point about sort of missed opportunities, but also sort of meandering around. I mean, I think it's one of the most interesting things for me is that when a new government comes in, their manifesto is probably 95% domestic and 5% there's like sort of passing reference to international affairs in there. But then you can imagine your two domestic and international entrees as prime minister and number 10 on, day one of having foreign government. Your entree is on the urgent issues is all international. In most cases, it's crises that are happening abroad that you're being asked to respond to as a country whose response matters from a diplomatic standpoint, from a military standpoint. And I think this is a good time. The UK's participation in the situation in the Red Sea at the moment in respect of the response to the Houthis is a very instructive point, which is to say there are some who are, bemoaning the UK's standing in the world, who are saying that we can't quite contribute the way that we could. Those conversations were often happening in a vacuum. This is not a vacuum. This is a very serious, very intense international conflict situation that has a lot of implications for the region, not just for Yemen, but also for Jordan, for Egypt, for countries like India that have significant trade concerns when it comes to the Red Sea. And the UK's response to that, alongside the US and I think it's a dozen other countries, speaks to the fact that other countries will put their names on a document in support of an initiative, and it's important, especially a country like Bahrain whose name is there in support of this operation. It's not easy for them, but really there's two countries, the US and the UK. Whether it's right or wrong, the approach, we won't get into that. I think the subject matter there. However, we are there along with the US, and that speaks to our standing. So, to speak to that in terms of where we stand in the world, I always think of a few lenses, sort of defense, development, diplomacy, soft power, and trade. And there's a kind of role conception standpoint. How do you perceive yourself? And then there's a kind of role capability standpoint. What can you do? From a security standpoint, we're still a top 10 country, especially in respect of a power projection capability standpoint. There are not many other countries in the world that can project military power the way the UK can. Certainly from an economic standpoint, I think we're still sixth in the world, aren't we? India leapfrogged us recently, but I don't see that changing anytime soon. Diplomatically, we can get into that in terms of the number of posts abroad, position in relevant multilateral institutions. I like to point to the convening power that Rishi Sunak was able to bring to bear when it came to making changes to international corporate tax, which is not something that got a huge amount of attention a couple of years ago, but I think it was nevertheless important. It shows the role that we can still play on those issues that we have a leadership capacity for. Development, I think we all know the decline in 0.7 aspect of it, but I think this is an opportunity to rethink development completely. And this is much more your world than mine, so I'd be interested in your thoughts. And then on soft power, it's about the power of attraction. If you put all the countries' flags in a row, the UK flag, I guarantee, would be one of the most recognizable. And with that, a huge depth of knowledge about this country. And that's so powerful. Apologize, I've been rambling, but I those lenses are useful.
No, you haven't. The things that I often think of, essentially UN Security Council, permanent position as opposed to temporary positions. And that brings a level of influence that at the moment, even when things are stuck, there's a symbolic and actual influence to that role, isn't there? Nuclear, the fact we're a nuclear power, the strong ties with many Commonwealth countries which have been fostered over a long time, and therefore they're significant, even though we'll talk about our alliances currently. The English language, which it links to your last point, I think, and you've talked about the military capabilities. Yeah, these things are, they guide us towards needing to define where does that take us? What is that space that is not the great powers of the time, not the we are absolutely not the US, and really need to get a handle on that. We're not at the top table. We're not, as you said, the country. No one's looking to see really what the UK's election, what happens with it. I mean, it will be factored in, but we're not the main gaze, are we? Very, very important to understand that. And yet, when people talk about the UK as the middle power, and I've explored this a bit in the podcast as well, when we compare ourselves to countries that sit very comfortably with the term of middle power, Australia, Canada, you're the expert on, it doesn't quite feel right either, because it feels like not only does it feel right in terms of the comparison in capabilities in some areas, but it also doesn't quite sit right with the British history and identity. It feels a difficult reach for Britain to get to the point of describing itself as a middle power.
I mean, I think that's it doesn't feel right. I think that should be underlined, bolded, and starred and everything else, because I think it doesn't feel right because it's not right. We're almost pushing back against two things. One are the kind of often right on the spectrum who continue to think of the UK as a great power, as it, I imagine these people almost just not having changed their mindset from the 1940s and 50s to now. And I don't think they're right. I think that it's just not. It just is. The capabilities point is important because we don't have those. We can't sit at that table in the same way. And we haven't for a long time, by the way. This is not something new. This has been a reality for a number of years. However, we do also have to push back against people trying to peg the UK down, in particular, people in this country who are trying to peg the UK down as a middle power. The benchmark middle powers, the whole concept came out of following the Second World War, when the Canadian government was trying to understand where its place was in the new world order, as it were, I suppose, at the time, and saying, we're not part of the kind of emerging countries that are coming out of a process, often very, very difficult process of decolonization in the same way, but we're also not the US or the Soviet Union, or even the UK and France. And so that's where that concept came from. And it's been a comfortable place for a lot of countries, as you mentioned, also Australia. But there's never been a sense of, there have been moments where Canada was able to lead, and other middle powers have been able to lead quite well as what you would call norm entrepreneurs, which is thinking about new ways of approaching international challenges. So we can talk about the Rome Statute, following, the ICC after that, the Landmines Treaty in the late 1990s. Decades earlier, Canada's involvement in the creation of the UN and making sure that there was non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council. Those are sort of moments when a middle power is able to make things happen, often, if not always, through having a coalition of countries. I think that the UK has often been at its best when it's working through a coalition of countries, but I think it's also a country that's much better able to lead those coalitions, especially when the US has not always been the most reliable multilateral country. The UK has always been. The UK has always been a significant contributor to international institutions. It's always been a reliable and constructive state member of these institutions and has a huge reserve of leadership and credibility to draw on. And we're not just doing ourselves a disservice by saying, yeah, well, we don't really cut it anymore, so why would we bother pushing a new agenda or a new thinking? I think many people would say they've missed the UK's confidence and leadership over the last number of years. I don't know how you feel, if that's an accurate description, but...
No, I was waiting for you to say major power. Explain more about that, because I think that's, for me, that offers a roadmap and a route towards unpacking this more.
So the great power, when we're taking early 20th century, Germany, Russia, Britain, France, that was the time of great powers, the US. It was a genuine multipolar world. And it was really since the Second World War was the last time we had a genuinely multipolar world. And so, as everybody has said, and I think they're right, we are now entering into a time of a multipolar world. So you have Russia, US, and China, the major power, the great powers, forgive me. And then below that, I think there's another tier of countries like the UK and France and India and Brazil and Turkey. And I think other countries are moving in this direction, that have regional influence in a big way, that have an international presence when they choose to, increasing confidence in respect of some and ongoing confidence in respect of others. And then you have countries that are, I think, the middle powers, the ones that necessarily don't have that same level of agency, if you see what I'm saying. Does that make sense in terms of how we cut it?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to reflect on is essentially after Brexit, the idea of global Britain was trying, Boris Johnson's vision certainly was trying to hark back, wasn't it? It was communicating in a way about Britain in a way that was trying to hark back to us as a great power, as you said at the beginning. Great Britain, that framing was very emotive. There's a strong emotional communication through that message, and yet it's not the answer. We don't believe that's the answer. It's not the answer to pretend to be a great power and to unrealistically amplify and pretend to be something that isn't reflected in the current world. But there's something about the fact that it spoke to something in the British psyche or spirit, I guess, that was important, that when you go towards middle power, and which seems to reflect a real sense of decline, and that's not, as you said, it's not reflective of the situation, of the actual context and our capabilities globally right now. But it also doesn't speak to the British people. You need a concept that captures a hope and a vision. And I think what's very interesting about the major power framing is that it allows us to understand where we are in the world, but then be very strategic with that position, that you say this is, and the decisions that you make can be, and the leverage that you use is then from a strong starting point, but you have to be very clever with it. And to note, I think, is, for me, there's something that we can learn from middle powers about that. So we may have more military capacity, more connections, perhaps more to draw on in the role we take in the world. But countries like Canada, like Australia, I was talking actually to someone from Argentina recently. There are lots of examples of countries that have played roles, and they automatically start from the position that you can't spread yourself too thin. You can't do everything, and therefore, what are you going to do? And that wisdom we can most certainly take, I think, from that group of countries.
I think definitely. This is the key thing about major power. I think you're absolutely right. It's about being strategic, literally sometimes picking battles from a regional standpoint, from a sector standpoint, from an issue standpoint. But nevertheless, I think offering international leadership, but understanding where resources are best directed. I just wanted to, in terms of, you mentioned kind of the Brexit and global Britain, what we need is sort of the confidence and the vision, and the sort of the philosophy and the underpinning thinking that I think in many ways was missing from global Britain. When it comes to Great Britain, The interesting thing is, going back to my earlier points, Great Britain, if I'm not mistaken, historically refers to the coming together of the nations of Britain as one country. We're talking like 300 years ago. And Gordon Brown talks quite a bit about this, about how the UK is the first and the most successful multinational country. And I think that should be one of the sources of pride and confidence, and the idea that we shouldn't be afraid to say Great Britain, because it is, and it has been for a very long time. It just doesn't necessarily refer to our standing vis-a-vis the great powers now. And I think that there's an honesty to that. And I also think that, it's a reflection of the history of this country that I think is quite positive in many respects.
Yeah, of course. And the other aspect, I guess, of the language or the vocabulary about Great British is there's the TV programs, aren't there? So there's Great British Bake Off, Great British Sewing Bee. I mean, I've named this podcast Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast also to reflect a confidence and a pride, right, in who we are. Part of my rationale around the podcast naming was this, the riffing off that idea that there's something that captures our cultural identity when we use it in that way. And I think that's
which are popular in every country. I mean, that's the thing. People do not find that strange. They find it like very British, very quaint, very entertaining, and just something that you wouldn't get in any other country. You know what I mean? Britain can get away with this.
And the reason why that's important to this conversation, actually, and we've partly alluded to it, is there's so much to a national conversation about a country's position in the world. There's also about its own identity, isn't there, and cultural traits and what it brings to the world, I guess, and who it is in the world.
I think absolutely right, and I don't necessarily want to belabor this point about sort of multinationalism that I was referring to in reference to some of the things that Gordon Brown was saying about the country's history. But one of my favorite public historians in this country is a man called Michael Wood, who used to do all of these documentaries back in the day about English history, but then he did some really excellent stuff about India and other parts of the world. But I've read a lot of his work in recent years, and he talks about the fact that in terms of immigration, the country has always been a destination for migrants, going back to, the sort of Anglo-Saxon arrival, and then so arrivals, since then in so many different ways. And it's been a strength of the country to be ultimately a multinational, and in many cases and points in time, a multilingual place. And I think that will undoubtedly be a cornerstone identity feature for this country in general, but in particular when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I love that. And so let's summarize where we've got to so far. So essentially we're saying there is a moment right now, the kind of start of a new era, or it can be perceived like that from our internal political and national dynamics, but also the fact the world's changing so quickly. That moment is really necessary, and it's a moment for a kind of new underpinning framework, something I'm very passionate about, I know you are too, is that is visionary and confident, right? And it's hopeful, and it's something we can anchor ourselves in with pride. But it's also a realistic reflection of where the world is today and who Britain is right now. And I guess the summary of that is we need a concept and an underpinning sort of framework or philosophy that helps us transition our self-concept. We've said that we've had certain moments in the past when Britain's been clear about who it is in the world and what it's doing, and that's important because you make decisions based off that, don't you? Foreign policy is very responsive, but at any given time things can happen and you have to take very quick decisions, and you need to have the bedrock of a paradigm of how you're looking at your country in the world in order to make those decisions well. And that transition of that self-concept is kind of one of the things that we're really thinking about, aren't we?
If I could, I mean, not to get too academic-y on this, but in my book, it's role theory. The whole idea is that each country plays a role internationally. And so there's role conception, which is how the country itself views itself and its role in the world. There's role performance, which is basically foreign policy, like how a country decides and what it decides in reference to what it does in the world. There's capabilities, which is what it's capable of doing based on what we discussed before, military, economic, soft power, it's all these different mechanisms. And then there's sort of role perception, which is how other countries view you as a country. In some cases, it's in part based on how you're conceiving and sort of conveying yourself internationally, but it's also their own conception of your country. And I think it is an important question because capability doesn't always mean performance. You look at Germany. Germany is perfectly capable of being a very proactive, assertive, and in potentially interventionist country in the world. It chooses not to because it doesn't conceive of itself that way for all the reasons we know, including its history. That's not the UK. In many ways, because of its history, it's very active. It's very performative and engaged in an assertive way, as we're seeing going back to the Red Sea. The idea of some countries automatically being alongside the US in that active way is completely foreign, both from a conception standpoint and a performance standpoint. It's not for the UK. That's where we are. And I think we are kind of at a role conception standpoint, we do need to reconsider and revisit the elements of our country from top to bottom and how that feeds into how we conceive of ourselves in the world. But then there are those capability and sort of expectations, big role expectations that countries have of us. They expect the UK to be there in a very real and often, quite dangerous way. That is not the case for many other countries. And all of that for me plays into what a new foreign policy vision and framework will look like.
And it's partly the distance that's partly why the difference between the concept and the perception is also partly why I think there's a bit of a struggle right now. Our national identity in the world is not solid and secure, is it? Yep. Let's put it like that.
Absolutely.
And when there are conversations about this, we often get it often centers around the fact that other countries have been no longer believe that we will uphold law and order, for example,
yes.
or they don't know whether they can trust us or not. There are some things that have previously been a perception of the UK that are no longer perceived to be true. So you've got the perception has been rocked, I guess, as at the same time as the concept having been rocked internally and externally.
That is extraordinarily well said, especially for a country that was at the beginning of building the rules-based international order, as we call it, the rules-based international order, and to have one of those anchor underpinning states that had been seen in most cases at most times as very reliable defender of that, deviating from that position in recent years. As you say, it's absolutely rocked. It's rocked the UK's perception, sort of self-conception and everything else, and the expectations that other countries have of us. But I do think that it's played a role in eroding to an extent the confidence the world has, I suppose, in these institutions and norms.
But I really like what you've just laid out there, because what that allows us to do is have a roadmap towards finding that hopeful vision for the country. And what I find is when these things are talked about, Brexit, the response of the world, there's also obviously been political turmoil and whether we can be trusted or not is part of that. But I find that you can end those conversations, it can sound a bit depressing, not hopeful. It can become a story of decline, right? So you end up with these two realities you're almost choosing between: the global Britain, great power, aspiring to a past that is no longer. I mean, many of us would, of course, say we shouldn't aspire back to that. But then the opposite becomes a story of decline, of lost power, lost influence, and lost leverage. and not being able to be trusted. And to me, neither of those are acceptable, really, right? As a country, we can't settle for those things. We have to find a new way forward.
I completely agree. The story, whether it's a story of decline, really is up to us, because the capabilities are there for us to not sort of decline and retreat and to, remove ourselves from the active elements of international affairs. I mean, one of the questions that I've been grappling with in my head for a long time is whether or not the UK's perceived decline in the last number of years is somehow a structural decline, or whether it is sort of an anomaly almost. And I say to people, this country went through a very difficult period in the 1970s in terms of its financial situation, its political influence and capacity on the international stage. But then we returned to a position of significant leadership in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and basically right up until the last half decade, I would say, when our own kind of domestic issues, I suppose, to an extent, curtailed, or at least we became more withdrawn. I think that we can actively return to a position of significant influence and thought leadership and norm setting. The world is different than it was in the 70s. You didn't have the significant presence of countries like China and India and the rise of many other countries that we've seen in the last number of years. But that doesn't at all mean that the UK can't continue to be a significant international actor.
And so, talking about capabilities, that's an interesting place to kind of land in terms of the need to be strategic, right?
Mm-hmm.
That if we consider that understanding ourselves as a major power is a useful anchor, and so what flows from that is being a smart power, needing to be strategic, smart and considered with our capabilities and our resources, right? Tell me more about what you're thinking along those lines, or how that flows for you from that overall concept down into how we then translate that into strategy.
In summary, it means that we can't be everywhere, but we can be in more places than most other countries. Right? We're never going to rise to the position of a superpower again, in the sense that the United States and increasingly China are able to be in all parts of the world with significant economic development and military presence. However, we do have a more significant economic, military, and certainly soft power and development, humanitarian assistance respect than most other places. And I think that will continue, and I think it can grow in all of those vectors. But that, of course, depends on the policy making that we undertake in this country. And then from the strategic side of it, it's a question of where. And as you see...
And with who.
And with whom, yeah. In terms of the coalitions and alliances, the AUKUS aspect of it is an important one. There's a lot of reasons that the UK should become more engaged with and supportive of Australia in that part of the world. The UK is not going to have an independent presence in the Asia Pacific, but together with Australia, with the US and India, with our other long-standing allies, there's absolutely no reason why we can't play a cornerstone role in a sort of alliance arrangements within that part of the world. Maybe alliance is too strong a term. Coalitions, collaborative security arrangements and for economic arrangements. I mean, we just came onto the CPTPP. And so it's a question of how we maximize that, how we leverage it, not just from an institutional standpoint, but use that as the foundation to more deeply engage countries like Japan and South Korea through these platforms that we have a common membership in.
Yeah, exactly. Where this really opens up is the strategic use of and building up of soft power and leverage, isn't it? How we leverage and lead coalitions, an active participant coalitions, and how we use soft power. And this is the crucial bit. And for me, it's actually, this is where the moment really matters, because we can either very strategically and in a purposeful and intentional way build and use that soft power and that leverage in our position in the world, or we can take it for granted or not have it as a priority, and it will decline, it will diminish, because that's what soft power does.
Yeah.
If you don't focus on it. Yeah,
and it needs to be consciously, strategically instrumentalized. If you're not using it, Russia and China don't consider soft power engagement as some kind of second tier order of competition transaction. It's a first order competitive element for them. And the West, and in particular the UK as a leader when it comes to soft power, need to view it in that same respect.
And we've just touched on some traditional partners, haven't we, as well? But another part of this conversation is, of course, emerging partners, non-traditional partners, partners that haven't been part of our country's history previously necessarily, but actually looking at the world as it is now and deciding which countries we're going to deliberately build relationships with or keep relationships with in this new landscape of transactional geopolitics, many rising powers, new countries with exciting agency in terms of how they're shaping the world as it looks from their side. I'm really passionate about this. I think that there is a huge opportunity right now that the UK isn't quite getting its head around. And that is that there are a whole set of countries, sometimes entire regions, that as they look at their own position in the world and as they build their futures, there's often with young, ambitious populations who are really pushing their governments and their leaders to create opportunities for themselves and their countries. These countries want to proactively build alliances with countries that they haven't previously had as strong ties with. It's partly to do with them diversifying their own alliances and links across the globe. Some of it's to do with creating more links with the Anglophone world, where they haven't had them previously. And so I'm thinking about regions like North Africa. This is particularly pertinent in French and Portuguese speaking sub-Saharan Africa. There's Central Asia, there's parts of Latin America, and Britain really ignores this at its peril, right? Because there's a real win-win to strengthen ties with countries and parts of the world that proactively want to link to Britain. And this doesn't have to mean, I think there can be a reaction in Britain. We have limited resources. We're talking about being strategic. So let's just concentrate where we already have large embassies and deep links. But I think, as we've talked about, in a changing world and in a world that really is looking quite different now, and where there are a lot of pivot countries and the dynamics of global linkages are changing, we cannot just be linked to countries that we share history with and have been linked to for a long time. We have to be open to building to the open invitations from other countries to strengthen and build ties that in the past have been weaker. And because it is a win-win situation for us and the countries that are approaching us on these things, you can achieve win-win with limited resources and limited investment if you get that win-win right. If you find something that you can offer and make really smart decisions around what Britain can offer and how it can partner and what a country is looking for. And so that means taking really smart decisions around embassy locations and size, messaging, the way that we message those partnerships and work with those governments, and particularly around linguistic and educational links. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and they are ones that they won't be open forever. Countries are actively right now each country in the world is positioning themselves in this kind of new world order. They're looking for opportunities, but how we react when a country is interested in connecting with us is extremely important, and that window won't stay open forever. This is part of it, isn't it? This is why old paradigms don't work anymore, and there does need to be a new paradigm, because it is in essence a new version of the world.
And to build those partnerships meaningfully, such that, they're all very concerned about, the national interest deriving value from their international engagements. And the reality is the UK has a huge amount to offer that many other countries don't. One of the things that I think a lot about at the moment in some of the work that I'm doing is that the UK is the world's third largest e-commerce market after the US and China. And there are so many countries in the world, in particular in the Middle East, that, I spend a lot of time thinking about, a huge number of their real economic activities. So outside of the extraction intensive industries that have dominated a lot of the economies for a long time in that part of the world, the real economy is happening online, especially for women. There's a huge number of women sellers. And, what role does the UK have in sort of stimulating that element of those countries' economic growth, whether it's access to e-commerce platforms in the West, where there are a large number of buyers. The products that are being exported from this part of the world are very, very good quality. They're very sophisticated. But it's also about how to increase their access to market, how to increase their scale, how they hire more people. And that is when you start to see a real economy grow and emerge. And that's absolutely what the leaders of those countries want. And if we can help facilitate that, then we become a serious partner.
I absolutely love that. And there's a final thing I want to add in as well about us transitioning our self-concept. We've talked about how being a major power and being a smart power are useful framings as we think of how to redefine who we are in the world and our position in the world. And I think a last concept that could be really useful is one of being a pioneering power. And that's really about holding firm and using something that's a historical identity and strength of our nation, which is that we have in our history we've prided ourselves in being out in front, at the cutting edge of innovation and collaboration for progress, being inventors, setting trends, and being seen as a country to look to see where things are going, what cutting edge innovations and breakthroughs there are. And I think this is really something that we could leverage as we look at who we are in the world, because that's about understanding our global convening power.
Mm-hmm.
And really seeing it as an opportunity, like we've talked about, and really seeing it as an opportunity to pioneer new approaches and convene cutting edge and progressive global responses. And I think the British public, the British people, I think resonate with seeing ourselves as having a history of being inventors and innovators, offering a whole set of the world's great scientific advancements and setting trends in other domains. And so this is something really for us to explore, I think, is how we utilise that historic national trait as a pioneer and see ourselves as a leading international ideas entrepreneur, I think it is that you call it, right?
Exactly.
That enhances our power of attraction and is able to influence multilaterally and regionally through new mechanisms. And that might be on AI, renewable energy, climate change. I think it's really about identifying our global innovation strengths and then combining that with other regions and other countries in order to accelerate innovation. And what I'm interested in with this concept is that it is one which feels to me like a call to lift up our heads, right? As Britain, as we said, we need neither to be a disillusioned great power and nor to have a narrative of decline. And what I like about looking back at some of our national and cultural traits and particularly strengths is that it's a kind of metaphorical call to lift up our heads, right, with a hopeful vision and look at what we can really contribute to the world and what we can help create in the world and the positive progress that we can be part of being a leader in and that we can mobilize around. Amazing. Okay, what a conversation. This was the inaugural one, wasn't it? We are ongoing looking into these issues, aren't we? And keen to
have conversations with and generate conversations about this issue. And so I want to invite any of our podcast listeners who have listened today and been chomping at the bit to get into the conversation, that have heard things and thought, oh, I really disagree with that. Or, well, of course, what you're missing is X. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. If you're one of those listeners, you can go on to the podcast website, which is www.greatbritishforeignaffairs.co.uk. And there's a contact form there, and just submit your ideas, send your ideas to us. We're absolutely looking to hone our own thinking and continue to develop this conversation by crowdsourcing wisdom, and anyone can have thoughts on this. This is very much not just the remit or the responsibility, I guess, of foreign policy professionals or thinkers or intellectuals. This really is anybody who lives in Britain and has thoughts about the British identity and who Britain is in the world right now, has something to say into this conversation, because it is a moment for our nation to be thinking about who we are in the world.
And if I may, Anna-Joy, in addition to that, anybody listening from abroad that wants to tell us your thoughts about what do you think of Britain?
Yeah.
What have you been thinking about Britain historically in the last number of years? Do you agree with the perspectives that we put forward? How would you like to see Britain act internationally in the future? It'd be very helpful, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. What an amazing privilege to chat through this with you.
My pleasure. Thanks very much to your listeners.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.